Where do pirates get their hooks?
Where?
Secondhand stores. Hey everyone, welcome back to Brand Coverage. I'm Brandon Carney alongside Pat Gustafson. I am your dad joke merchant and also fantasy football aficionado,
Kyle
or
Pitts
so I at
merchant.
least like to think. All right, listen, we'll get to the Kyle Pitts section of the
It's the
program.
Kyle Pitts episode.
Eventually, yeah, look, I know this is what everyone's been waiting for. Am I in on Kyle Pitts? Am I out on Kyle Pitts? Because last year, Pat, no matter how many people tried to convince me that I was going to fall for the Kyle Pitts trap again, I told everyone heading into last year, it wasn't going to happen because it was the same exact situation that baited me into Kyle Pitts the year before, and nothing had changed. And I stuck by my word. I had 0 shares of Kyle Pitts last year, and thank goodness I did because he sure wasn't good. And essentially, 0 Falcons were fun to own last year outside of Bijan Robinson, and even he had, hiccups because Arthur
The
Smith is a
Jonnu
fucking
Smith
goon.
erasure is disgusting.
Yeah, Jonnu Smith, yeah, was unironically the better fantasy tight end in that room, and that
he
is
was.
just that
At
is
least
just
for a good
a
amount of the season.
disgusting reality that we are forced to face. Folks, welcome back to the show. I do want to give our little spiel. If you are joining us here on YouTube, be sure to check us out after the fact one of these days on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. We are on all audio platforms. And if you are listening to us on an audio platform, come join us live on YouTube one of these days, youtube.com/BenchwarmerBran every Tuesday, 7:30 Eastern, live and in person. You could come hang with me and my pal Pat here. And also, good little piece of housekeeping news, Pat. There was a duplicate output of our podcast on Spotify for some reason that had just been up for a while. It was like the exact same thing. I would upload our podcast and it would just have like 2 identical shows almost, except one of them was categorized under like it was American football, but also basketball and sports. And it was like, it had like 12 ratings compared to our main feed that has like over 300. Super weird. I think people found it and were like, I don't know what the fuck this is. So like they would actually rate that one lower. Point being, I got it removed. So there's no more confusion for anybody out there that's trying to find this podcast anymore, at least on Spotify. Got on with Spotify support and got that taken care of. Yeah, I think at one point when we were under the heavy umbrella, we were categorized with like just every major sport essentially, but I don't know why it kept uploading to a different output because I wasn't doing that myself. But we got it taken care of, folks. So if you're looking for us on Spotify, there won't be any confusion. Luckily, there's only one feed there. Folks, let's get into the topics for today. I wouldn't necessarily call this news, but I guess it's Joe Burrow's opinion. But Pat, it's something I wanted to go over because I think it's a really smart and well thought out thing that he came to the table with. And I believe this was floated in the past as well, but it's something that, as an NFL 18-game schedule starts looking like maybe more and more of a reality here in the next couple of years, Burrow had incredible suggestions for how to approach that, and I just wanted to go through it because I thought it was a great idea. He said on Pardon My Take that if the NFL goes to 18 games, there should be 2 bye weeks. I think we all pretty much agree with that.
I think that'll probably happen.
Yeah, I think that would have to happen. But he suggests that one of the bye weeks should be around week 13 for the entire NFL with Pro Bowl festivities that week, similar to how the NBA does the All-Star Weekend. He also believes this would boost the ratings for the Pro Bowl, which I think that's hard to argue with because in the middle of an NFL season, people are going to be like, this one random week that there's no games on, like, yeah, we'll watch the goonery that is, dodgeball and the catch competition, whatever, why not? There's nothing else going on that Sunday in general. And then he also says by adding a second bye week and an extra game, the Super Bowl would fall on the Sunday before President's Day, giving most of the country a day off after the biggest game of the year. Now, that is a big one that this country has kind of talked about for a long time, was just even if, the schedule didn't get changed, just making the day after the Super Bowl a holiday in the United States, I think has been a long talked about possibility just because of how ingrained football is into our culture. But this kind of 2 birds with 1 stone here, Pat, that would just make it fall on a day that people generally have off anyway. And I think these are all great ideas. The one thing that I saw people kind of, push back on a little bit was that if you have a Pro Bowl sort of event in the middle of a season, then, players aren't going to want to participate, to which I'm like, I'm sure you could incentivize it to be like, look, if that's going to be the second bye week, like obviously Pro Bowl games and festivities are way less strenuous than an actual game is. Like, just be like, hey, we're going to give you this bye week. It's just if you get selected to the Pro Bowl, like you got to come hang out. Like just do that. It's better than having to play an actual game that week as far as, the strain on your body is concerned.
Yeah. And I mean, I like the idea. The only thing that I think would just never happen is that Pro Bowl, just because I do not think, CBS, Fox, ESPN, NBC, Amazon, all the other ones, I don't think these TV companies, God, I'm already stumbling over myself, but I don't think they're going to go for that, because obviously it's going to be so much harder for them to sell ads on a Pro Bowl or a completely no bye week. It's going to be difficult for that, and so much of the league and vice versa goes through those media deals. So I just think that would be such nearly an impossibility with the way that these companies operate. Not that it's not a good idea, but I also think too that obviously for the fans it sucks, but I think a lot of the players, especially the players in the Super Bowl, appreciate the week off, because I know they want to be in the best form possible, the best physical shape possible. So that bye week helps. Obviously, it's arguably the worst weekend of the whole year. But 2 bye weeks is necessary. It's necessary if you're going to do 18 games. And I just don't think that these media companies are going to be like, yeah, we're cool with that. But the President's Day thing is just slam dunk. Like, yeah, you don't even need to make it a national holiday, because we're just going to set it up with one.
Yeah, I do wonder if the TV networks, though, would, there could be a sort of negotiating back and forth there where it's like, look, we're giving you an extra week of NFL football. Like, if you got to eat this extra bye week on top of it, like, if we're giving you a full-on extra week of games, then, like, that's the trade-off. But, yeah, look, there's going to be a lot that goes on above my pay grade as far as trying to sort that stuff out. But I think Burrow's definitely got a nice little bedrock of ideas here. And, look, maybe they'll go through with it. I would vote for Joe Burrow for, NFL commissioner, but also probably for U.S. president at this point, mainly because he's not 97 years old. So Joe Burrow can just have pretty much all the power that he wants. Pat, the other thing that has kind of been making the rounds around the internet is this Giants sort of special edition of Hard Knocks. And what's really been going around is so many clips of general manager Joe Schoen talking about Saquon Barkley and just the inner conversations in the front office about what they were going to do with Saquon, what their direction was going to be for the team this year. And I don't want to frame this as like, they did something surprising, because they didn't. We knew Saquon was probably not going to be a New York Giant, months ago, before the season even ended. It's just, it's kind of a bad look to me for all this stuff to be going around, where it's essentially a bunch of clips confirming how much their chips are all in on Daniel Jones. And you and I think both recognize that is a sinking ship at this point. So not that, Saquon would save them by any stretch of the imagination, but to see Joe Schoen be like, we're not paying a quarterback $40 million to hand it off to a 27-year-old running back or whatever it is. I'm like, well, you're about to be
hand the fucking Devin Singletary.
You're about to be dealing with this $40 million a year quarterback, throwing a total of under 20 touchdowns and trying and failing to target Darius Slayton 50 times a game. But hopefully it's Malik Neighbors for us fantasy folks out there. But it's just, I don't know. I think the Giants are doing themselves really no favors being in the spotlight here and rehashing this Saquon situation with all the. I don't know if they thought this would be a good look as far as explaining their logic, but it's like, for any of us out there that understand what Daniel Jones is at this point, just not a very good look. And Pat, I'll just say this: I'm very much looking forward to Saquon's games against the Giants this year.
Oh, God.
I think they are going to be absolutely electric, and this man is going to come with a vitriol perhaps never seen before in the NFL.
Yeah, and you forgot a bit of news here. Our favorite Brandon on the show, Brandon Aiyuk, watching Commanders
again?
film.
Yeah, whatever.
I feel like we talk about this clown every week at this point.
We do. We do.
Again, just almost like, wasn't it Debo 2 years ago who was like unfollowing and following on social media? It's like, what is it with some of these players where it's just like they want the spotlight to be kept on them? Maybe they want it in the sense where it's like, hey, all these eyeballs are on me, so get something done, San Francisco, whether it's extending me or trading him, because I truly believe that he wants to stay. Obviously, if he gets paid, but I think it's just like, it's just exhausting at this point. Over Brandon Aiyuk, very good player, but like at the end of the day, this is Brandon Aiyuk. Like we're not talking like Patrick Mahomes here. We're talking Brandon Aiyuk.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen players of really all skill levels and talents bitch at various points. I think Aiyuk is still probably on the higher end of those players. But yeah, again, Pat, it's just the same message that we've had for the last few weeks. It's just somebody fucking do something. Just shit or get off the pot. I'm tired of Brandon Ayuk's little passive, like, oh, here's a clip, another one suggesting that, I might be somewhere else when the season's... we get it, buddy. We get you and Jaden Daniels are friends. You have the Arizona State connection, whatever it may be. I'll say this, Pat, because I don't think there hasn't really been a need to dive into what Brandon Aiyuk would look like on the Commanders, because it hasn't happened yet. So, we're not going to analyze such a far out hypothetical, but like if that does happen, God, the Commanders become impossible to evaluate to me for fantasy football. Like
Really?
It's just so gross because we've talked about, we went through the NFC East a couple weeks ago, and like Terry McLaurin is due for some positive regression, I think. Essentially what it would do is kill Jahan Dotson, which is fine. But
Fine.
I don't know who to bank on for fantasy points when you have a rookie quarterback who's expected to lean on his legs, has two really good receivers, then Terry McLaurin and Brandon Aiyuk. And the only thing to me that's making me relatively confident in a Terry McLaurin positive regression is because their receiver room hasn't changed. They added Ben Sinnott or whatever, but they if anything, they just lost Curtis Samuel. And so that bodes in Terry's favor. It just makes things so messy to me if Aiyuk actually ends up in Washington, for both Aiyuk and the players that are already in Washington, that I don't want it.
Now let me ask you a question here. Aiyuk currently on Underdog is 17th overall, wide receiver 12 at 18, going 18.2 is his ADP. Where do you think that changes if he's in Washington?
Oh boy, if he's in Washington,
I think it's in a similar place, honestly.
Yeah, I don't think it changes too much, which is funny because you can't really be going from one situation to a much different situation than Aiyuk would be going from the 49ers to the Commanders, like one of the most historically in recent times, just absolute well-oiled machine of an offense, and because of that, it means different players are going to be highlighted different weeks, whatever, but that 49ers players are going to get theirs on a given week. Washington is just still trying to be a competent franchise at this point, out from under Dan Snyder's ownership, kind of trying to pick up the pieces, new quarterback, new coaching staff, all that. So it is definitely a very different situation. But in terms of projected workload, I think I could see a world where it's better for Aiyuk just because he is so tight with Jaden Daniels. It could be one of those cases where it's the player just has such an affinity for the receiver that it ends up working out better for him, much like how, you and I both believe very heavily in Tank Dell, just because he and CJ Stroud are like this, they're very tight, that it's the addition of Stephon Diggs, while it certainly makes things muddy, you just believe that connection will win out. I could see that for Aiyuk, but I don't think the draft slot would end up being very different. I could actually see a world where I would be maybe a little more optimistic on him, even though I just mentioned that, it becomes just kind of gross overall. I don't know what happens with Terry in that situation. It makes Eckler's even involvement weird because he's expected to be a friend of the podcast, Austin Eckler. It makes his impact, should he hopefully have one this year, is going to be through the pass game. So, we'll cross that bridge if and when we come to it. And if Brandon Aiyuk gets his way, we'll come to it eventually, I guess, but who the fuck knows?
Maybe.
Folks, we are going to get into our final divisional preview of our series.
It's already been 8 weeks.
It's already been 8 straight weeks of this stuff, and it is the NFC South Fantasy Football Preview.
Fulfill your fantasy.
Pat, upon my preparation for this segment, I realized that this division probably has the most turnover of any division, just in terms of coaching. Every single team in this division.
Teams.
Yeah, every team in this division has a new offensive coordinator. So you've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Liam Cohen coming in as Dave Canales exits, and we'll mention where he went in a second. The New Orleans Saints bring in offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak, who was the 49ers pass game coordinator last year. The Falcons have an entirely new staff with head coach Raheem Morris and offensive coordinator Zach Robinson. And the Carolina Panthers are where Dave Canales ended up, so they have a new head coach, along with offensive coordinator Brad Idzik, who was with Canales in Tampa Bay as their wide receivers coach. So it's one of those divisions, Pat, where it's not a completely forget what you know situation, but it's a situation where you almost have to forget what you know, or at least acknowledge the fact that there could be some drastic changes just because of the fact that you've got new guys leading the way here.
Yeah, you're basically kind of going to be, we're basically going to be equating it to what these other coaches have done in other situations, plus with a little bit of precedent based on what we've seen from these players. But this was definitely the most interesting one for me of the 8 to, kind of look over this morning. And at the same time, there's a lot of good here, but there's a lot of yuck. And I mean, most of that's just the Saints and the Panthers, but there's a lot of yuck going on. But I think there's still going to be a lot of really good players, possibly one of the best players in fantasy football come from this division.
I think, Pat, with a division like this, with so many new coordinators and, multiple, honestly, aging players across these different teams, I think this division might have the highest opportunity for a league winner to emerge, like somebody who is truly being drafted just incredibly late and just ends up being a monster for your fantasy team, because we don't know how these teams are going to shake out. We don't, like, these offensive coordinators don't have allegiances to certain players. Like, they're coming in with a blank slate, although, the head coach that they're stepping into will have, maybe some opinions on it. But honestly, I'm not sure Dennis Allen has like any opinions on anything, because he just seems like kind of a fucking moron. So Clint Kubiak might just be able to give the ball to whoever he wants. And then I assume Liam Cohen is mostly going to have, free reign offensively, with Todd Bowles being a defensive focused head coach. So it's going to be really interesting, Pat. We'll start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have won this division, I believe, 3 straight years now. Baker Mayfield, this one is kind of one of the easier and quicker ones to evaluate, because quite honestly, Baker Mayfield is just not a fantasy relevant quarterback, not on a consistent basis, at least. This is the kind of guy that, you might stream in the right matchup. But I think the most important thing about Baker Mayfield is last year he proved that he's a fine and can be a fine real life quarterback, and can at least lead an offense that is competent enough to foster, other fantasy relevant talent. Mike Evans was wide receiver 5 last year. Rashad White was RB7. So he put these guys in enough scoring opportunities and kept that offense on the field enough and moving down the field enough that these guys were able to be good. But just in terms of the offense on the whole, Pat, I am a little bit worried with Dave Canales gone.
I am too. I mean, I think we'll talk about it too when we get more to the Panthers, but Dave Canales has worked magic in back-to-back stops with Geno Smith in Seattle and then Baker Mayfield here. And, it's not like they just promoted Canales as next in the line. Brad Isaac went with him. So, they get Liam Cohen, who is also a Sean McVay disciple, but prior to his days at Kentucky. So is this kind of going to be like more of a Sean McVay run offense, or which Baker Mayfield played in very briefly? Raiders fans will never fucking forget that. Oh my God. But, or will this kind of be like some of what the Bucs we've seen before? Like Baker, zero interest in terms of drafting him.
Right. Naturally.
I'm really happy for him to see that he's kind of made a career now where he's got a nice contract, where he's kind of beat the bust allegations. Like, will he ever live up to those expectations as the first overall pick? No. But he's shown that he can be a solid player in this league, and I think he will be. But for fantasy purposes, like I said, all I really care about is what does he do to this receiving core, which does not have as many options as you'd think.
Yeah, we can start with the receivers, Pat, and work our way back to the running backs. Mike Evans. So obviously this is the big name in this receiving room. And I have actually some interesting stuff here on Mike Evans. So, Pat, you'll remember Mike Evans was maybe the biggest overperformer last season. I mean, his ADP was wide receiver 33 heading into last season. He finished as wide receiver 5.
It was insane at the time, I think.
It was. Here's the thing. So here's the notes I have on Mike Evans. Coming into last season, Evans had only finished outside the top 12 3 times in 9 years, which gives credence to your, that being insane take. The worst of which was wide receiver 24 all the way back in 2015. The others being wide receiver 17 in 2017 and wide receiver 16 in 2022. Now, that wide receiver 16 finish, somewhat understandably, is what people focused on because that was his most recent season. He's getting older. The Bucs were going to have to,
nobody
adjust.
Baker Mayfield. Too.
Right, exactly. The Bucs were going to have to adjust to life without Tom Brady, so it was like, okay, he just had this, down year with Tom Brady, and Baker Mayfield is not an upgrade. On top of all that, Pat, that wide receiver 16 finish, if you'll recall, was a little bit deceiving. He was actually a lot fucking worse than that because
he had huge. He had won like 3 touchdown game, I think.
The last week 17 of 2022, Evans went for 10, 207, and 3 touchdowns against the Panthers, which. If you take that game away, Pat, he averaged 10.2 half PPR points per game, which would have put him as wide receiver 30.
That's downright awful. So like, if you're following that trend, like, yeah, wide receiver 33. Right. I mean, I think wide receiver 33 was a bit of a leap to make, but there were signs pointing there. But I mean, I feel like with Mike Evans, is there been just more of a steady wide receiver in the last decade than Mike Evans? Like, Mike Evans is the model of reliability, of consistency, and I mean, the guy's going to be a Hall of Famer someday because of it. But the question that we're just going to keep asking is, does this stay sustained in this offense? Like, well, we talk about it, like, really the only guy that's really fighting it for competition is Chris Godwin. They've got, like, Trey Palmer and some other gaggle of guys.
Jalen McMillan they brought in as a rookie from Washington.
Like, and then Kate Otten, who, I guess we'll mention him quickly later, but exists. That's the thing is like, you look at this and you see, like, wow, there's really only two primary targets. This team did not target the running back a lot last year. I was actually shocked by their running back usage I was looking at. But, so you think, like, this is up, Evans, he's got the world at his fingertips. And what is he? Wide receiver 17. Wide receiver 17. I think he finishes closer to a wide receiver 1 than he finishes to a wide receiver 3.
I'm torn, Pat. I'm torn. And here's why. So I highlight all that stuff from 2022 to make that point that I don't think just because, he had this crazy wide receiver 5 finish last year that we've necessarily escaped the woods of that wide receiver 30 finish that he was on track to have if he didn't have that insane, week 17. Like, this is a guy, there's a reason he was being drafted wide receiver 33, and it's because it looked like it was over for him. Like, Evans, as much as we want to paint him as this model of consistency, and from a real life perspective, he absolutely
From a real life perspective, yes.
Exactly. 1,000-yard seasons, in his sleep, essentially. But that 1,000-yard season 2 years ago was filled with mostly downs. Like, I'm not even going to say ups and downs. You look at that game log from 2022, because he had those 3 touchdowns in the last week of the season. Think about it, Pat. That's only 3 touchdowns otherwise, because he had 6 total that year, for the first 16 weeks of the year. Yeah. The fantasy point totals were really, really gross. And this is my concern, because Baker Mayfield just had his career high in touchdown passes with 28. He only came close to that one other time, and it was in 2020 where he had 26 touchdown passes. If Baker Mayfield comes back down to earth here to like 21, 22 touchdown passes, a little bit more in line with what he's done in his career, and has that decline because Dave Canales is gone, that sort of touchdown pie that Mike Evans is pulling from, and he's had all these solid finishes because he's had double-digit touchdowns. I'm not convinced he's going to have double-digit touchdowns. So I understand, that you could definitely do a lot worse than Mike Evans because of that sort of 1,000-yard floor. But, like, I think people forget, Pat, how annoying and how almost, like, he wasn't quite Gabe Davis 2 years ago, but, like, it was that sort of, I'm going to have you in my lineup and you might be useless. And on top of all that, he's 2 years older now than he was then. And you know how I feel about age. So Mike Evans he concerns me a little more than I thought he would before I started digging into all this and kind of remembered how bad he was 2 years ago. And look, if you think that, Liam Cohen is going to be able to keep Baker Mayfield afloat and let him kind of at least repeat these 28 touchdowns he had last year, or even improve upon that, and that's not impossible, then yeah, Mike Evans is a perfectly valid, wide receiver 2 pick, or even wide receiver 1 if you go running back early. But for me, Pat, I know where that floor is, and I can't get that wide receiver 30, on track average out of my head. It does bother me.
And I guess piggybacking on your point with the touchdowns, and I guess this kind of glides right into Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin had 1 touchdown last year, and it was week 16. Or their 16th game. Their 16th game of the year. I owned Chris Godwin last year, and it was so hard because, like, he was certainly droppable, I think.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's like, it's Chris Godwin. So it was one of those things where you couldn't do it. But then you look, and he still gets over 1,000 yards for the 3rd straight season. And it's like, do we expect that kind of positive touchdown regression from a guy like Chris Godwin, who's not this red zone threat the way Mike Evans is one of the best red zone threats in the last decade, and Kate Otten, which is really all he does, is kind of a red zone threat. So it's like, do we see this kind of positive regression from Godwin, or do we kind of see him be the same player where it's like, you've got to hope he catches 5 or 6 passes a game, which granted, he did that a good amount, but that's not a particularly sustainable thing. And at wide receiver 36, he's going 58th. Again, that's underdogs, just ridiculous wide receiver bias, but he's going as a low-end wide receiver 3. And I feel like I'd rather have guys with a little more upside than Chris Godwin.
So, in fairness, I have not really. I've kind of looked at who he's ranked near, but Pat, I do have some numbers for you that suggest I am actually pretty interested in Chris Godwin this year comparatively to Mike Evans. Not that I think he's going to be better than Mike Evans, but I'm more interested in the value at cost. So, here's what Liam Cohen and the Bucs and Chris Godwin himself have been saying this offseason is that they are going to deploy him from the slot a lot more than he was this past season. Now, Godwin in 2021 and 2022, both those seasons, ran over 70% of his routes from the slot. That was where he made his home. He finished as wide receiver 17 and wide receiver 20 in those years, respectively. This past season, Pat, 38% of his routes were from the slot. He basically got that slashed in half, completely different usage, and finished as wide receiver 30. So he was also targeted a lot more in those slot years. He averaged 9.1 per game in 2021, 9.5 in 2022, and just 7.6 in 2023. Considering the wide receiver 35 or so ADP that he's near, Pat, I could very much see a world where he ends up back near, wide receiver 20, wide receiver 17. Now, I'm not saying I don't think he's going to get back to, his breakout year in I think 2019, because he had Jameis just fucking slinging the ball all over the place, and there was just a lot of offensive numbers to be had in that offense. That's not going to happen because Baker's not throwing for 5,000.
He was the wide receiver 2 that year.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Baker's not throwing for 5,000 yards, but based on his finishes the 2 years prior to this one and how they want to kind of return him to form and get him in a role that Cooper Kupp was in when Liam Cohen was the Rams OC. He was not the reason Kupp had that insane season. He actually wasn't even there yet. But it was the year after that Kupp was still, heavily targeted out of the slot, used in high leverage ways. I think Godwin is going to get back to a point where he is a usable fantasy asset. And Pat, if he gets back to, again, that reasonable sort of finish between like wide receiver 17, wide receiver 20 that he had the last 2 years, getting that at wide receiver 35, you're gonna be thrilled because you're plugging him into your flex spot based on where he's going, and that is a ideal sort of flex spot guy.
So basically what we're saying is we think, if anything, Godwin would benefit from the new offense, while a guy like Evans might suffer.
I think just there's nowhere to go but up usage-wise for Godwin. And Evans is a guy that has just a lot of things working against him. I don't know that, Liam Cohen's scheme or what he wants to do with his players necessarily goes against Evans. I think the things that go against Evans are just the likely drop-off for the offense as a whole. And then also, like, his age, that's just something that can, take its toll over time. Maybe he doesn't show any signs of decline due to age, but it is strictly, an offensive decline. I think those things just work against Evans. Again, I'm not going to predict that Chris Godwin finishes with more fantasy points than Mike Evans. Do I think it's impossible? No, not in PPR leagues. But in terms of like value at cost, again, I am far more in on Chris Godwin than I am Mike Evans. But Pat, let me take a look at who Chris Godwin's near, at least on Fantasy Pros, because I think it's about the same.
Underdog, I'm looking and seeing a lot of guys who are very, he's going right after guys like Keenan Allen, Jaden Reed, Calvin Ridley. Yep. And then before these really big question marks like Xavier Worthy, Rome Odunze, Jordan Addison, Rashee Rice, DeAndre Hopkins. So it's like a very kind of yuck. Or, potentially solid, but like yuck generally group of wide receivers. And it's like, that's kind of how I feel about him. Also, after owning him last year, I could be a bit biased there. But
oh, sure.
But it's just so bizarre because, like I said, there's no one else in this offense, at least that we think, that is going to be a significant factor in this passing game. Outside of, I guess, Cade Otton, but even then I'm not, expecting him to make some kind of big cut into it. So it's like, you think there's plenty to go around for both of these two guys. But
yeah, and I mean, that would be the one thing that would hold back, this positive regression that I'm forecasting for Chris Godwin is if Trey Palmer or Jalen McMillan, made a name for themselves. And I don't think that's impossible at all. Jalen McMillan's gotten a lot of positive buzz in just these little, mini camps, and as well as Trey Palmer taking a step forward. So whether that's actually going to turn into, a fantasy relevant role, I don't know. But either way, I'm interested in the flyer that is Chris Godwin because I think the volume, Pat, again, you're looking at possibly 9 to 10 targets a game if he gets back to that role and that sort of usage. I love that sort of theoretical rock solid floor for a guy in your flex. I think getting back to form is one of the big things I'm watching this upcoming season. Pat, the backfield here. You have something to say about Godwin?
Well, it was kind of going to shoehorn into the backfield a bit.
Yeah.
Or segue, wrong word. Basically, the thing that shocked me was this team had the least amount of rushing yards in the NFL last year.
Oh, wow.
And they
I didn't
produced
realize
the RB 7, I think Rachaad White was.
Yep.
And I think that's just mostly because of the fact where it's like nobody else but Rachaad White was worth a fuck in that offense last year. In that backfield, in that backfield. But for a team that conceivably relied on throwing the ball, you'd think Godwin would have had more. And it's like, are they going to keep leaning into that under Liam Cohen? Or are they going to kind of really keep leaning into Rachaad White, who, while I'm still not sold on Rachaad White as a real-life football player, we've clearly seen his ceiling as a fantasy player, where he was put him in and leave it. Mm-hmm. Set it and forget it kind of running back last year, which was crazy. And I think part of that's because of the lack of competition. And the biggest thing is that they did not add a whole lot of competition. They draft Bucky Irving, and they bring back everyone's boy, Chase Edmonds. Big Chase Edmonds guys here on this podcast.
Oh, no, we are not.
So it's like, was last year Rachaad White more of a fluke, and, he's kind of going to come back down to earth? Or is this who Rachaad White is in fantasy?
Let me check the time real quick. It's slander Rachaad White o'clock. Okay, that must mean we're in July.
This isn't Kyle Pitts yet.
That's true. So, astute listeners of brand coverage, it was off the bench when I did this last time, and the formerly off the bench podcast will know that I very much was excited about the prospect of Sean Tucker this time last year, at least as a flyer, because of just the fact that Rachaad White was an unproven back. There were touches to be had in this backfield. And Pat, here's the beautiful thing about fantasy football and fantasy football analysis is you can be right and also wrong. I was right about the fact that Rachaad White isn't that good of a real-life running back. He was one of the most inefficient backs in the league. He didn't break tackles. And I think the opportunity was there for the taking for somebody else to step in and be like, I'm the more efficient back. I'm the guy you want out there. The problem was that guy simply wasn't on the Bucs roster.
They didn't have him.
It wasn't Sean Tucker. He didn't hit, the ceiling that I hoped he could hit and take some of those touches from Rachaad White. Now, let me just illustrate some of this stuff with Rachaad White first before I get into, what else I'm feeling about this situation. He basically volumed his way to an, what do I have here, RB10 finish? I think I meant RB7, or maybe it's different formats. Either way, he was a top 10 back last year. But Pat, per Fantasy Pros, who pulled these numbers from the Fantasy Points data suite, White was second in carries, 9th in targets, and 9th in red zone touches among running backs, which is beautiful. You'd love to see that from a fantasy perspective. Yeah. Despite the fact that out of 49 qualifying running backs, he was 42nd in missed tackles forced per attempt, 40th in explosive run rate, and 45th in yards after contact per attempt. Now, there's a difference between a team continuing to give a guy insane volume during a season because they realize they don't have any better options and giving him that same workload again the following season once they realize, what he was truly doing on the football field and they have an opportunity to add somebody. Because of White's lack of efficiency, Pat, I do think the Bucs are going to try to work someone else in, whether it is Chase fucking Edmonds. And look, if it is Chase Edmonds, I don't think Chase Edmonds is going to end up with any standalone fantasy value because he's just not very good at football either. To me, Pat, this all creates a really nice opportunity potentially for Bucky Irving. And so just for me to put a bow on the Rachaad White situation, I am probably going a different direction than Rachaad White. I understand the positive case for him because, look, there's absolutely a world where there's, again, no one else in this backfield that's worth giving the ball. And so they're just going to keep giving it to a relatively inefficient Rachaad White, and his pass-catching skills on top of, high-volume rushing is going to turn him into possibly an RB1 again. But I don't like relying on a guy as my RB1 when I know he's just not that great of a running back from an elusiveness standpoint, from all those standpoints I mentioned in those statistics. So it makes me very interested in Bucky Irving. How are you feeling about Rachaad White, Pat, heading into this year?
It's one of those weird things because looking at the ADPs on Underdog, and it's like looking at the guys after him, and there's not a ton of those guys that I'm seeing like if I had to choose, I'm picking them over him. I just think it's going to be one of those guys that I'm just going to pass on him, let somebody else take him at his ADP, and then settle for some of these guys after him there. There's been a lot of talk about the downfall of Kyren Williams this year, but I think Rachaad White, in terms of talent, is a better candidate for that. Obviously, the thing plaguing Kyron Williams is that Blake Corum exists. And if Blake Corum was in this Tampa Bay backfield, for example, book it. Like, book this shit. I think Rachaad White, but the fact that he's even going as RB15 after the year he had last year, and the fact that they did not do anything significant to alter that backfield, just kind of goes to show that, like, even people don't believe that this is going to happen again. And obviously I'm out at his ADP. Again, sometimes fantasy football's vibes. It's a little bit more of a vibes thing, but it just feels like last year was way too good to be true. And, like, we could be sitting here and he could be this year's James Conner. Because you look at James Conner 100%. Last year, everyone's like, oh, it's all volume dependent. The guy's not good. The guy's about to fall off a cliff, blah, 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 blah. And you know what happened? The volume was still there. And we could be looking back halfway through the year, end of the year, saying, man, we were wrong about Rachaad White because the volume was there. So it's like you would truly have to believe in Bucky Irving to think that, like, that downfall is really going to happen, which is why I think Irving is a great late round flyer because, again, at that point in the draft, those picks are free. Those picks are free. You may not have that guy by week fucking 3, for God's sake. So, but yeah, I'm not very enthusiastic. Like I said, I'm going to let somebody else in a league take him at his ADP. I'm not going to sweat about it, and I'm just going to let it kind of go.
Yeah, I'd rather I'd rather bet on backs that have some of those more attractive underlying numbers as far as tackles broken and explosiveness and just maybe haven't gotten the workload yet to really put them onto the scene versus a guy who's gotten all this sort of volume and throughout all that volume showed you that, yeah, I'm kind of just going to take this and do the bare minimum with it. Like, again, if you owned Rachaad White last year, you're probably listening to me talk and thinking I'm fucking insane because he was really good for you. Like, he backpacked your fantasy team, but volume will do that. But when you're not efficient with that volume, that team is going to reevaluate whether they should continue giving you that volume. And I do think, Pat, this really does all depend on Bucky Irving. But based on what I've found about Bucky Irving and looking into him as a player, it's why he's a guy that I'll probably be taking a lot of flyers on at late in drafts because his main player comp that I saw from a source I trust greatly is Jaylen Warren. And as far as, a backup running back that you're hoping will take on a role for himself, there's probably not a lot of better players to be compared to than Jaylen Warren in terms of seeing the field immediately. His game is predicated on his vision, his elusiveness, but he also has decent power for a smaller back. I expect him to have a role this year. I don't know if that's going to end up being a fantasy relevant role where like you're comfortable starting Bucky Irving on a weekly basis, but I could see that happening. And the fact that I could see that happening and, he's a guy who's going, RB 54 on Underdog, 175th overall, that's a very, in terms of trying to separate some of these rookie backs, I think that is more than a viable player and way like guy that I think will stand out above a lot of these other rookies that got drafted in kind of the middle rounds. I don't remember exactly what pick Bucky Irving was selected with, but I think it was I want to say 4th round pick. Yeah, 4th round pick, 125th overall. And once you get into those
not crazy draft capital, but like
right, but also not nothing. You're not looking at 5th, 6th, 7th round either. So these 3rd and 4th round guys, there's always a handful of them that pop up and are actually really, really, really productive for fantasy football in their rookie years. I could absolutely see Bucky Irving being one of those guys. So yes, I am going on year 2 of the Rachaad White hate tour, and so therefore he's going to finish as a top 10 running back once again. Pat, I don't think we have to say too much about K-Dot, and we kind of touched on him. We're just going positionally. Tight end 21, 177.6 ADP. There's just there's better flyers.
I think unfortunately he's one of those guys that'll be in a decent amount of lineups midway through the year just with the injuries and bye weeks and guys not following through. I feel like Cade Otton is one of the I almost called him Cade Opton. I don't know what happened there, but I think Cade Opton. Fuck, I did it again. I think Cade Otton is one of the poster child for that kind of tight end. But yeah, even as kind of these tight end 2 flyers, I have no interest in Cade Otton.
Cade Reed Opton, Cade Option, whatever. The New Orleans Saints, Pat.
Ew. Sorry.
Starting with these quarterbacks in this division is not a fun time. Derek Carr is spearheading this one. And Pat, I've had my quarterback rankings put together for a while. It's wide receivers and tight ends that I've been slacking on. And when I opened up my quarterback sheet, I went all the way down to quarterback 30 when I did my initial rankings. Derek Carr wasn't there. He wasn't in my top 30. I had to slot
I
him
did
in.
25, and Derek Carr is not there.
Yeah, I had to slot him in behind Drake May, Russell Wilson, and Bryce Young. So, and yes, obviously, he'll play right away, and Drake May might not, but I would rather a guy not play than a guy play fucking poorly. So, Derek Carr, he actually ended last season kind of hot, Pat, which was really odd. I expected to open up his player card and just see absolute dog shit throughout the entire course of the season. But the last 4 games of the season, he actually went for 20, 25, 16, and 27. So they figured something out at the end of the year. But from week 1 through 14, I mean, you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sub 10 point performances and not getting over 21 times. So this is just not a guy you should be considering at quarterback. There's always a chance on the far end of the range of outcomes that, Clint Kubiak comes in here and figures something out with this offense, and Derek Carr gets back to what he was with the Raiders for a while, Pat, which was, a guy who you considered as a streamer at the very least. He was a solid bye-week quarterback. But as of right now with New Orleans, he is not that, and I think we are looking, or at least hoping more, for Spencer Rattler to take over at some point than we are for Derek Carr to actually figure anything out and be worth the money here in New Orleans.
The Taysom Hill erasure is disturbing. But Derek Carr, straight up, I think he's just kind of washed. I think in I almost said Oakland. Well, I guess he did play in Oakland. So with the Raiders, he was kind of this volatile player to begin with. Even in his best years, he was slinging a lot of touchdowns, but he's always been prone to just these terrible mistakes, interceptions, and the older and older he gets, the more and more that's going to be exposed. And I don't see, despite having 2 real strong threats in Chris Olave and my boy Rashid Shaheed for deep threats, can Derek Carr still be that Derek Carr anymore? I don't think so. Obviously, zero interest fantasy in Derek Carr, and he was always kind of one of these take Kirk Cousins, take Derek Carr, they're safer picks. They don't have the upside, but they're safer picks. Derek Carr has vanished from that realm. Has vanished from it. He is in the shadow realm now, basically, of quarterbacks. And we've had this question in the viewer question. It's which coach will get fired first? The answer should be Dennis Allen.
That was my answer. Yeah.
The answer shouldn't be Dennis Allen because he should not still be here. Straight up.
Exactly.
Again, another former Raider.
I feel exactly the same way about him as I did Josh McDaniels last season. Why are you still here, and how long is it going to take for you to get fired?
Yeah, I think that I am just more underwhelmed with the Saints as a team that I might be than any other team. And now the question is Chris Olave is going at wide receiver 13 here? Yeah. Wide receiver 11, an underdog. So can Derek Carr sustain wide receiver 11 in his current state? I love Chris Olave. Chris Olave was one of my pals last year, and he let me down.
You say his current state makes it sound like he's in a vegetative state.
He might as well. God, sorry, Derek.
His current. We're not sure if he's going to pull through.
I'm gonna might have to go get.
We
the
don't know if
jersey
he's going to pull through. If he does, he might support a fantasy wide receiver 1, but we'll have to wait and see.
But can Derek Carr support that? And I don't know, and that's why Chris Olave really scares me as a wide receiver 1. He was my pal last year. I loved him, and I'm like, God, him and Derek Carr will have this great connection. Well, it turns out Derek Carr's only connection was Alvin Kamara when he was standing 3 feet away from him.
Oh, my God. What a brutal stretch of the season that was. Pat, I would vividly remember being at my buddy's house, and his dad had Kamara, or was facing Kamara in fantasy in a PPR, full point PPR league, and I'm just watching him get targeted play after. I'm like, do you guys have nothing else on that play sheet other than give it to Kamara 2 inches from the fucking line of scrimmage? Because this is painful. It's awful to watch.
He had 75 receptions last year, and what was he suspended for? 3 games?
3 games to start
3 games.
the year.
He had 75 catches. Before that, he had 13 games. In 15 games in 2022, he had 57. And in 13 games in 2021, he had 47. Mm-hmm. That's insane. And I guess that moves us into Kamara now, who...
Yep. We'll get back to Olave because I do have some other thoughts on him.
Of course.
We'll go back to him first.
Has he lost a step? Because I feel like that's sort of what people are basing this off of, is has Alvin Kamara lost a step? And of course, Alvin Kamara used to be an elite running back, real life and fantasy. And while that's not the same, I think that he, with Derek Carr in his current vegetative state, dumping the ball off constantly, that PPR floor makes Alvin Kamara a weekly play. Is he a guy that, like, I'm ecstatic about drafting at what, RB 18? Not necessarily. But if things happen where, like, you go wide receiver the first 2 rounds and you kind of like are like, oh shit, now I need to take a running back in this dead zone area, I suppose. Alvin Kamara, you could do a lot worse than Alvin Kamara, I think. And people love Kendre Miller, man. These underdog drafters, these best ball drafters love Kendre Miller. I was shocked. I was looking for him on the second page. I'm like, no, wait, this guy's on the third page? That's crazy. And I didn't find him there. And I'm like, this motherfucker's in the top 50.
Yeah.
And he was. He RB 42, 139.1. It's to the point where on our sheet, I put Jamal Williams before him.
I saw that, yeah.
I put Jamal Williams before him because I assumed they were in a similar range. Do we really think that Kamara, like, losing a step with age, is that going to tank him that much and bring Kendre Miller in? Because people thought that, like, oh, there's going to be a role for both of them. And there really wasn't. Miller had like 3 spike games where he had 9, 12, and 13 carries. Besides that, he didn't have more than 3 in a game.
Yeah.
It's like, is he really going to become that much more involved in this offense to, one, make him... Obviously, our RB42 isn't like, oh, you're starting this guy. But people like him enough to think that, like, hey, like, this is a guy who could really possibly make an impact. Is he going to do enough to do that? Is he going to do enough to cut into what Alvin Kamara has established there in that offense?
Yeah, I think so, Pat. And look, I don't know if this is just the mood I'm in today with thinking that all these young backup running backs in this fucking division are going to be really good. But that's kind of where I'm at with Kendre Miller. I'll start with Kamara, Pat, because we talked about how he is a PPR demon and those numbers he had last year were ridiculous. It was really a tale of 2 segments of the season, though, as far as Derek Carr's just relentless peppering Kamara with targets. So after returning from that 3-game suspension, Pat, to start the year, he averaged 9.75 targets per game in his first 4 games. He literally looked like a top 5 running back in PPR leagues for those first few weeks. Averaged 17.3 fantasy points per game in half PPR. That volume did not last after that initial burst. Still productive, but averaged only 5.2 targets per game, so almost cut in half over the final 9 games of the season, which is more in line with his previous 2 years' averages in terms of targets per game. So that it got, you can look at the season total and be like, oh, why did he get so many more targets? It was really just for 4 games that happened, and after that, it got a little more back to normal. But Pat, even after that, those final 9 games of the season with fewer targets, he still averaged a respectable 14 fantasy points per game in half PPR. Yeah. So as a pass catcher, like, he's still a problem in a good way. Like, he's not going to go away. I do think he's going to be a fantasy asset. However, as RB 18 on Underdog, that is certainly too rich for my blood for a guy who, as far as between the tackles, as far as rushing, as far as, again, all these metrics that I love to reference as far as missed tackles and elusiveness and all of that stuff has been tanking for the better part of a couple years. And I do think the situation is ripe for Kendre Miller to step in there and take some of that work. Now, last year was a struggle. Kendre Miller was a rookie dealing with a bunch of injuries and just... Yes. I don't think he ever got off the ground last year. Now you have a guy who is presumably healthy right now, and not only healthy, Pat, stepping into his second year, which is always nice as a rookie or as a player. You don't have to worry about just adjusting to life in the league in general while also fucking rehabbing every week. So I think Kendre Miller's a guy that, like, his metrics and his limited action are really nice. He also, in his last year at TCU, put up 244 carries for 1,399 yards and 17 touchdowns. The Saints spent the 71st overall pick on him, which is very much not nothing. I mean, that's an early 3rd-round pick. Yeah. And then among players with at least 40 attempts last year, Kendre Miller was 21st in missed tackles forced per attempt, just barely trailing guys like CMC, Mostert, Jerome Ford, and above guys like Derrick Henry, Travis Etienne, Kyron Williams, and way above Alvin Kamara. So Kendre's number was 0.24 missed tackles forced per attempt. Alvin Kamara was 0.14. So he almost doubled him in that category. And also, as my boy Andrew Cooper will note on Twitter, the 3 teams, Pat, in the NFL that used the fullback the most in 2023 were all from the Shanahan coaching tree: San Francisco, Miami, and Houston. The Saints hired Clint Kubiak.
Baby.
The Saints hired Clint Kubiak out of San Francisco and immediately signed 2 fullbacks to their roster. Xander Horvath, and Adam Prentice. So this all bodes well to me for their attempt and desire to be able to run the ball more effectively this year. And I don't think that goal is going to come without trying the hand of a guy who is, we believe, a better actual running back than Alvin Kamara is. So again, I don't think Alvin Kamara is a guy that you're going to be like, oh, I can't ever get him in my lineup. That's how unproductive he's being. I think he's a guy that his PPR floor is going to keep him relevant. But I do think Kendre Miller is going to eat into his workload enough that you're going to be looking at Kamara as, to me, more of a flex. So I'm not drafting him at RB18, straight up, like not even looking his direction.
You know what's interesting though, because I was kind of looking at Underdog and seeing the guys after him, and a lot of these guys immediately after him, there's a red flag. It's like,
Sure. I mean, you
but
get
then
that
what's fucking
way.
crazy is you get down to like 26, 27, 28. That's when I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
So it's just weird.
I
There's
agree.
this stretch of guys like Aaron Jones, Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris, Jonathan Brooks, Zamir White, Jalen Warren, where it's like, yeah. But then it's like you get to James Conner and DeAndre Swift, Raheem Mostert. Like, you mentioned Jerome Ford's name. He's like RB39. What the fuck?
I don't understand what's going on. I feel like people are putting way too much stock in Nick Chubb just coming back and being Nick Chubb right away.
That's just what's crazy. But that's just kind of the weird thing to me is I think Kamara's in this such weird position of guys that are possibly being slightly overvalued in general compared to, or, you know, obviously some guys lower down the line that I believe are being undervalued. So, like, you know, this could just be a position, at least for me, like, I'm not probably taking a running back in this area. Like, if I don't go running back early, that seems like a good punt position because, like, you're seeing guys like Raheem Mostert and James Conner and Jerome Ford, guys who had great years last year. Granted, situations always evolving. But yeah, I just think that he's just kind of in this like dead zone before the dead zone. Like it's just dead because they kind of stink, not necessarily because of. But yeah, just again, like just a weird. New Orleans is just such a weird situation because Pete Carmichael is bad. Like he's just not. He did not do another overdue firing similar to Matt Canada. And it's like, can Clint Kubiak and all of his nepotism, is he gonna be a Shanahan disciple, or is this still gonna be the same Saints with Dennis Allen and his buffoonery and Derek Carr and his vegetative state? Like, it's gross. It's a gross team in my opinion, which leads us to Chris Olave, I suppose, who it's like, this is kind of like the meme where it's like the piece of shit house with like the Mustang under it. Like, that's almost kind of how I feel about this Saints team right now.
Yeah, so here's the thing with Clint Kubiak, Pat, and look, this is going to be his only second crack ever at being offensive coordinator. He was the offensive coordinator with the Vikings in 2021. But, I mean, look, if we want to evaluate that season at all, Pat, and not to give oh my God, Clint Kubiak, it's his father, but still, not to give Kubiak too much credit for, you know, Justin Jefferson's greatness, but man, he knew how to get his good players the ball. I'll give him that much credit. It was Justin Jefferson's second season, and he went for 108 catches, 1,616 yards, and 10 touchdowns on 167 targets. Adam Thielen also went for 67 catches, 726 yards, and 10 touchdowns. Now, I think 2021 Kirk Cousins, we all acknowledge, is better than 2024 Derek Carr. But I still don't even think, though, Pat, that, like, I don't think Derek Carr's incapable, if he has an offensive coordinator that knows what he's doing, of being allowed to spread the ball enough to get guys to decent production. He's not going to throw as many touchdowns as fucking Kirk Cousins did that year, because I think he was up well over 30. But I do think there's a world where Clint Kubiak is able to scheme these guys, you know, pretty well and get Chris Olave to that wide receiver one production. Kubiak, the things he's known for is basically using motion a lot more than what the Saints had been doing with Pete Carmichael. And motion is really just the most basic thing you can do in football to unlock some different things for your offense. Just keeps the defense a little more on their toes. I don't know why teams don't use motion at least half the time by default. I mean, the Dolphins use it something ridiculous, like 80% of their plays, and we see what their offense looks like. I don't know if teams just think their guys aren't in the cardio shape to do it, but the more motion, the better. And if Clint Kubiak is going to be able to double or even triple their usage of it this year, I think that's going to open up a lot of things for their offense. And I think with a guy as good as Chris Olave, Pat, if Kubiak was able to run an offense where they gave Justin Jefferson, granted it's Justin Jefferson, but it was 167 targets. I think they're going to give Chris Olave plenty enough targets to make him a wide receiver one, and I think he's going to return his draft day value.
And I think the one thing that's playing in his favor is the competition, which is kind of why I kind of started laughing, because I went and looked at their depth chart, because like, you know,
not an A.T. Perry guy, bro.
Shaheed was there. I knew A.T. Perry was there. Who the fuck is Bub Means? He's a first round. Bub Means. He was a 5th round pick out of Pitt. That just made me laugh. But it also just made me laugh that, like, you're looking at A.T. Perry, Cedric Wilson, Equinemius St. Brown, Bub Means, obviously Juwan Johnson as well. And it's just like,
expected to miss a large portion of the season as well, Juwan Johnson.
Yeah, injured. So like, what do they get, Adam Troutman back or something?
Foster
Moreau, let's go!
Oh, for fuck's sake. Great.
Hey, man, guy survived cancer. Foster Moreau for the win.
I know. Whatever.
But
that's not what I was saying.
Back to Chris Olave. Back to Chris Olave. Is that the competition for targets is not going to be crazy. Like, he should... Well, forgetting Alvin Kamara, who is probably going to make a significant dent in that. But besides Kamara, I don't see any of these guys making a super significant dent in this offense to the point where it can take away from Olave. So it's like, yes, like if you believe that Clint Kubiak can get the best out of Derek Carr to get wide receiver one production out of Chris Olave, then more power to you. Again, you know, it's just in this area, again, because obviously we're going to be talking about somebody else that's going as a late wide receiver one. You kind of look behind it and you kind of see some more red flags. Guys like Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel, Nico Collins, Jalen Waddle. Devontae Adams doesn't fit that category, but those four in the sense where it's like there's a lot of target competition on those teams. Chris Olave does not have that. So if that is a big feather in his cap, again, I think it just might be a case of like, I just might not be picking a wide receiver at this point in the list here, me personally. But I definitely think he has the opportunity here. It's just, what does Derek Carr do? And now, it's time for everybody's boy. Apparently everybody's boy, because this guy's ADP is a little bit absurd. And it's Rashid Shaheed going at wide receiver 52. We've seen this guy's electric. This guy is one of the fastest guys in the league. Are they going to give him the usage? We talked about this last year too, where it's like, are they going to give him the consistent usage? Because beyond big plays, we talked about it last week with Jameson Williams, where it's like beyond big plays, it's like you need to produce here. And is he going to be consistently in this offense enough to do that? Especially under Derek Carr offense. I don't know.
I would think so, because who the fuck else are they giving it to? Like, we're looking at the main reason his ADP has jumped this year compared to last year is because Michael Thomas is gone, and we can stop trying to make Michael Thomas a thing.
Yeah, you tried to make Michael Thomas happen last year.
I did. I thought he had something left.
I didn't like it.
I was wrong. That's my bad. I apologize. But that's why, because Rashid Shaheed's a guy that, you know, Pat, as much as we wanted to keep trying to forget about him, we kept hearing his fucking name every Sunday because he's catching a 70-yard touchdown, even though nothing else is working for the Saints offense. It was either 70-yard Rashid Shaheed touchdown or 70-yard Alvin Kamara screen touchdown.
Or 3-yard Kamara screen for a first down, yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, you kept hearing this guy's name, and now he's stepping into what we have to assume is a full-time role, because what else are they going to do? Cedric Wilson, wide receiver?
There's been a lot of AT, like genuinely, there's been a lot of AT Perry talk coming out of Saints camp. And again, like, do I buy that into that enough, being like, wow, AT Perry's going to be a guy? Like, no. Mm-hmm. No, but it's like, I could see these two kind of figuring in the same amount to the point where neither of them are particularly fantasy relevant. Obviously, Shaheed's got insane tools to be just a menace out there.
You think he's a tool? You're rude. That's mean.
I've said worse about Rashid Shaheed on this podcast.
Yeah, you have.
I think I literally just said "fuck Rashid Shaheed," but I don't.
You 100% did. I have that.
I have. There's a short on that on the Clips channel. Follow the Clips channel, by the way. But there's I was just so mad that I was a Kamara owner the year before, and like, every time it was just like Rashid Shaheed 75-yard rushing touchdown. I was like, who the fuck is Rashid Shaheed? But now we know who Rashid Shaheed is. And obviously, like, it's true. What you said is very true. Like, we see his name regularly enough to know him. You know, he's somewhat of a household name here. And I guess, again, I am not particularly interested in him. Like, I would kind of rather have a guy who's got, like, a little bit more upside when you're kind of throwing a dart there. Yeah,
I feel like he has a lot just because.
Well, he's got upside, but it's just like, is the volume gonna meet this upside? Like, I just feel like it's gonna be like the way I feel about Jameson Williams, where it's just like the big plays are gonna happen, and we're still gonna see his name, but it's like, is this gonna be a guy that I'm gonna want to own in fantasy football when there's a point in the year with bye weeks, injuries, where bench spots come at a premium? Is Rashid Shaheed a guy that's consistent enough to where I'm going to want to own him? Right now, my answer is no.
Yeah, I the way I look at it is, he's going 102.9 overall on Underdog, assuredly much lower in actual redraft leagues because he's a wide receiver and Underdog's just horny for them. But wide receiver 52, like Pat, you're looking at a guy who's able to make so much noise with a part-time role that it's like, what can he do with a full-time role? This guy cracked lineups last year as a part-time player, and yeah, granted, you definitely ate some low points on some of those weeks because he was a boom bust player and may still be a boom bust player. But shout out to Dwayne McFarland who pulled this number out. In 9 career games where Rashid Shaheed had 70+% route participation, he averaged 12 PPR points per game with a 20% target share. So, that's a decent number, and that route participation could certainly go up. I just feel like this is a guy who already has an outrageous weekly ceiling because he could literally go 2 catches, 150 yards, and 2 touchdowns just from 2 bombs. Now, if you've got him out there in a full-time role, and I looked at the guys at Reception Perception do a great job of like analyzing what routes guys are good at and all that. And he's not just a one-trick pony. I mean, it feels like that's all we ever see from him is these fucking deep bombs that he's catching, but he's actually good at some other things as well. So I am curious to see what Kubiak can do with this guy. I think it's very much valid. If I already like Chris Olave, do I really think the Saints offense is going to be able to keep afloat multiple wide receivers in fantasy? That's where it gets a little bit dicey because then I have to reasonably project, a decent bounce back for Derek Carr, and I don't want to do that. But I understand the dart throw that you take at Rashid Shaheed just because of what he did with a part-time role and now is getting a full-time role. Also want to note that he's probably getting a big bump in ADP because in the Scott Fish Bowl, Pat, which has started drafting in the last couple days, their settings have basically buffed Rashid Shaheed to be like a top 10 receiver because they credit you for return yards. And he's one of the very...
God. Didn't he make the Pro Bowl? Wasn't he like an all-pro return man last year?
He is one of very few players who was like already kind of in consideration for your lineup, but also as a kick returner.
That makes...
And so
that makes sense with the ADP.
Yeah. So you get points for like every 5 or 10 return yards or something, and on top of the fact that he's going to be a potential full-time player here on the Saints. So yeah, I'm interested in Rashid Shaheed just as that kind of dart throw player. Pat, tight end again. Juwan Johnson injured is dicey for the. Let me check his actual injury status.
He was another guy that people really liked last year that unfortunately just did not get past the bye week streamer allegations, unfortunately.
It sounds like he's definitely murky for the start of the year, and even if he's back, he might not be 100%. So, a guy that people were kind of already excited about, it doesn't seem like is going to be a factor, at least early on. And then you've got, I guess, we gotta talk about Taysom Hill.
I was thinking about Taysom Hill
as a tight end again. Please,
that's the first of all.
Hill. Stop.
Like Underdog, he's QB 39. Here is the way I feel about Taysom Hill, where it's like, for sure that he's going to have weeks where he's going to rush for 2 touchdowns.
Yep.
But it's like, I'm a big gambling addict. I love playing blackjack. And, in blackjack, you could kind of do side bets, like match the dealer or 20 or whatever. But the way it goes is you have to either play it every time or never play it. Because if you go bounce in and out, you have no real sense of it. And that's the way I feel about Taysom Hill has been. Where it's like, you can't just kind of say like, this is a Taysom Hill week, or no, this isn't a Taysom Hill week. Like, there is no way to predict when this will happen. Which just sucks because like we have to mention him because he is going to be fantasy relevant if he is a tight end, which I believe he is on like ESPN and Sleeper. I believe he still is a tight end. So like we have to talk about him. We have to talk about him because what other tight end is going to get a direct snap from the 5-yard line? Nobody. But at the same time, it's like I cannot draft Taysom Hill just because that's agonizing. Even if you punt tight end and say, oh yeah, Taysom Hill's a sneaky pickup. He's going to be a sneaky pickup maybe 6 of the 16 weeks. And you just can't do that. You can't do that.
He's like a brain dead version of George Kittle with the boom bust.
It was funny because that was the same way I felt about when I was thinking
Yeah.
about that today. I'm like, I feel the same way about George Kittle, but just to a way higher regard than Taysom.
Yeah, a much lower upside version of George Kittle. I am going to continue banging the drum for Taysom Hill to be listed as a running back on fantasy platforms
agree.
until the fucking cows come home. Because Pat, we're beyond the point of like wondering what he is. These are his target totals for the last, how about for his career?
They didn't
Last
even
year-
list them on, I think it was Fantasy Pros. When I
not
looked at some
surprised,
stats from
'cause
earlier,
that's-
it just said passing and rushing. Did not even
Yeah,
list them.
I'm not surprised. So last year he actually had the most targets he's ever had in his career with 40, which is still not a ton, but 40. Before that, 13, 6, 12, 22, and 7. Meanwhile, Pat, his carries, 81, 96, 70, 87. And then you have 27 and 37 his first 2 years before they really knew what they wanted to do with him. My issue with Taysom Hill becomes when he is useful to you in fantasy and he has those blow up weeks as a tight end, it's because he was used as a running back. Like
I agree.
If you have to pick what to list him as, the way to save everyone the stress is to make him a running back, and then if you have the sack to start him as a running back over all these other actual running backs who are going to have more consistent, more reliable workloads, then congratulations. You deserve the ceiling that he can give you if he rushes for 3 touchdowns on a given week if you have him in your running back slot. But this situation where he glitches out the tight end system because he gets used like a workhorse back every 2 weeks is brutal. It's just painful.
And it's like, while you can disagree with that, which I think many people do, you can't just be like, oh, I disagree with this on a fundamental level, so I won't use him. It's like,
right.
No. Like, remember when Joe Webb was like listed as a wide receiver, but also just a starting quarterback casually for like that 1 week? Like, again, you have to exploit that. Same thing with fucking poor Kendall Hinton.
Kendall Hinton. I started him in a different league.
That's what I mean. It's like he was a literal quarterback, a different position in a different, so it's like you have to exploit that. But we've talked way too long about this poverty ass team. Let's get to Let's get to another poverty ass team that is potentially the biggest gold mine in fantasy football right now. And obviously we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons, who goodbye Arthur Smith. Goodbye Arthur Smith. Goodbye Jonnu Smith. I don't know if they're related. We don't know. Goodbye Michael Pruitt. Goodbye. But they've got 3 top 10 skill position players in Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and Kyle Pitts. The problem was it was Taylor Heineke and Desmond Ridder and Marcus Mariota throwing them the ball.
A real who's who, of course.
And I mean, we're not giving them Tom Brady here, but we're giving them Kirk Cousins, who Kirk Cousins in the last however many years in fantasy football has just been consistency. You're never going to get like a top 5 performance out of him through a season, but you know damn well he's going to be in that top 12. And what better quarterback to elevate this than Kirk Cousins? And honestly, it's funny I say this because like I'm not crazy in on Kirk Cousins, because I am a little bit worried about the Achilles. I was reading actually like some fucking scientific study today on athletes returning from Achilles, and what they got from quarterbacks was that they are 5 touchdowns less than what they had before. An Achilles injury. Very interesting. I'm not positive how they got this. These were a bunch of nerds, probably never even seen a football in their life. But I'm worried about that for him. But I love him in terms of elevating these players around him. Will I be drafting a lot of Kirk Cousins? I'm not planning on it. But if it falls into my lap, I'll just be like, okay, Kirk Cousins, yeah, solid. But I'm just a little concerned about his personal fantasy output. But again, I'm not as concerned as we'll talk about with what he's going to do for these young studs.
Yeah, I agree with you. I drafted Kirk Cousins in the Scott Fish Bowl in the 6th round Superflex league. So he's my second quarterback that I got.
Like, sir.
Yeah, no, I got him in the 6th round as my second quarterback, which I was pretty happy about considering he was like the 18th one off the board. I needed to get one last guy there before, it was kind of a tier break after him, I thought. But yeah, Kirk Cousins, Pat, I mean, I've talked about it before that I think people are overlooking the Achilles injury just a little bit, feeling like the Falcons are going to get just this automatic, original version version of Kirk Cousins.
Exactly.
But the fact is, look, he never relied on his mobility to begin with. And Achilles injuries, while they are absolutely a death sentence for basically any other position on a football field, as a guy who's just kind of tasked with distributing the ball around the field, it's not as impactful. So while I am nervous, I do think he can still do plenty, like you said, to elevate these other guys. And if you want to draft him as a safety quarterback, I don't know, you want to pair him with someone else late round, sure, go ahead. We've seen him be fantasy relevant in the past.
Or if you just kind of punt the position and want him to be your starter too, I think, like I said, I think you do a lot worse. But I'm just a little worried. And another thing about Kirk Cousins, low key, is that guy has an affinity to, like, similar to Joe Burrow. He finds the end zone with his feet. Or he did, at least. And obviously, I feel like that's going to take a big hit with this Achilles injury, just from a physical standpoint, and just from the fact that this coaching staff may not want him to be using his feet very much. So I'm not crazy in, like, let's see, let me check my personal rankings. I have him at 15. And that's behind guys like Justin Herbert and Trevor Lawrence and Jordan Love and Brock Purdy. So, like, still a very usable thing, but I'm just a little bit concerned, a little more compared to his ADP.
I would agree. I've got him at QB 16, and there's definitely some question marks there. But, Pat, let's talk about what the people want to hear about, which is these other weapons that we think are finally freed from their shackles. And just to mention it again, the new offensive coordinator here is Zach Robinson from the McVay coaching tree, which is always a good sentence that you want to hear. And the head coach, Raheem Morris, you expect him to pretty much give those keys to Zach Robinson to form the offense the way that he wants to. And we'll start with Bijan Robinson, Pat. I don't think we need to say much about him because we've already said it in a prior show, but for those who are listening now, potentially for the first time, Bijan Robinson to the fucking moon.
I love it.
This is a guy that I think has a chance to break fantasy football, as I said before. Handled only 47% of the Falcons running back carries last season, whereas a guy like Christian McCaffrey was up over 60%. And he's just really good. Like he's just really good. He's going to be a bell cow. Algier will get a few touches, but not enough to prevent Bijan Robinson from being, I think, potentially the RB1 overall.
Yeah, as we've mentioned, I have the second overall pick in Brand in my main league, and I'm down between him and one other player. But it's just part of me is just like, I just really want every piece of this kid I can. Like, I have him in Dynasty, and I'm psyched. I'm so fucking psyched for this year and beyond. Last year was tough, but we still saw, even when he was having some of these down weeks, explosive plays after explosive plays. He was involved in the passing game, which I think is only going to happen more often.
He just moves different. He moves so different from anyone else.
Bijan to the fucking moon. Again, I'm not going to call my shot and say he will be the RB1, but if we're coming back here in February and we're like, wow, Bijan Robinson was the RB1, not a single person should be surprised here. And I just think that the biggest thing holding him back was obviously not the quarterback play. It was just their fucking jarhead of a head coach who loved Cordero Patterson and jet sweeps with Jonnu Smith at the goal line. Tyler Allgeier's a fine football player. He's on another team. We're talking about him as a fantasy relevant guy, and he will be enough. He'll be a guy that'll get drafted in the middle rounds of the draft, whatever. Elite handcuff. No question about it. An elite handcuff. And a little more than a handcuff in terms of value, but yeah, I think that this is going to be... We've seen McVay offenses give the ball to the same running back time and time again. Todd Gurley and fucking Kyron Williams for some reason. And I see no reason why this is not going to happen again. Bijan to the fucking moon.
Absolutely. The receiving options, Pat. We've got Drake London here at wide receiver 10, Darnell Mooney at wide receiver 68, and then Kyle Pitts at tight end 6. So... We'll start with Drake London, I guess.
Yeah, I'll let you go on your rant, but Drake London, I've done a massive turnaround on Drake London. I remember when I first looked at the ADP, I was like, ew, 10th. Mm-hmm. Like, he hasn't proved himself yet. And it's like, sure, he really hasn't. But neither is Marvin Harrison Jr. in the NFL. Neither is Chris Olave fully. But the difference between a guy like Chris Olave, we talked about, is his situation is a little murkier in terms of quarterback play. Drake London is going to be playing with by far the best quarterback he's ever played with. And the thing that shocked me about this team was that they targeted their wide receivers. They were last in the NFL in receiver targeting. Yeah. They were first in tight end targeting.
I know.
Get Michael Pruitt and Jonnu Smith and whatever they had Cordero Patterson on the depth chart as. Get him out of here. Get him so far out of here. So the fact that they were dead last in wide receiver usage, there is no way that persists with this new regime, coaching staff, and with Kirk Cousins. We saw Kirk Cousins make Justin Jefferson the number one fantasy wide receiver. I am by no means saying Drake London will be the number one receiver or even necessarily close to that. But I have come to the turnaround point to the thing that I do think he will return on his investment and return on his ADP and finish as a wide receiver one, because we saw him. I think he had 1,000 yards last year or very, very close to it. Under those circumstances, the circumstances are way better now. I think, I think the sky's the limit for Drake London. I love Drake London now. He's by far been my biggest positive head turn of the off season by far.
Yeah, when Pat said he was between Bijan and another player at number 2, it was actually Bijan and Drake London. Drake London,
CeeDee
Pat,
Lamb.
I know. Drake London, Pat, as the undisputed wide receiver one of this team last year, got 110 targets, which was fewer than clear number 2 receiver Devonta Smith, fewer than Tyler Lockett, fewer than David Njoku, fewer than TJ Hawkinson, fewer than Sam Laporta. So yeah, you're looking at a guy, Pat, he turned those targets into 905 yards and 2 touchdowns last year, Pat. If he can get an extra 20, 30, even 40 targets and add in another 5, 6, 7 touchdowns, all that well within the realm of possibility with this reshaped offense, yeah, you're looking at a guy who's going to perform like a wide receiver one. And I think it's scary to project in fantasy football when you have to project something so different, but this offense is that different that I think that is a valid thing to do, and you gotta just kind of push through how scary that might be, that you have no evidence of it happening in the past, but this is how you get on the train before other people and find value.
We've at least seen him be decent under these circumstances, but that's the other thing too. Darnell Mooney's a nice player, and I think he has some fantasy value here.
I do too. Yeah.
But not to the
enough.
point where, not to the point, like, I think, again, Drake London is going to be the clear-cut wide receiver one in this offense. And even with our boy Kyle Pitts here, I think that, yeah, like you said, that was my initial concern. It's like, oh, he hasn't proven anything. It's like, how many guys that haven't proven anything have ended up finishing, as a top 10 wide receiver? It happens. It happens time and time again. So
Paging Puka Nacua.
No kidding. Like, if Puka Nacua could do it, a guy like Drake London, who was
even paging Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp was in the NFL for years before he went for the Triple Crown.
But this kid was the 8th overall pick. He was one of the top. I think he might have been the top wide receiver prospect of that draft class. Like, this kid has the talent, and now he finally has the opportunity where hopefully someone with a fucking brain is calling the plays here, and we can finally see what this kid's full of. Look out for Drake London in our Pat's Pals draft.
Wow. Okay, calling your shot on potential Drake London. All right, folks, let's get to the portion of the program that everyone's been waiting for, as we are almost an hour 20 into the show.
Yeah, we might need to genuinely push the Panthers to next week, because what else are we going to talk about next week either?
We'll get through them. Panthers don't have as many fantasy.
I'll say quickly.
Anyway.
I'm out on Kyle Pitts only because I'm worried about the knee, and I like a lot of the other guys going before or after him. I do not see myself picking a tight end at tight end 6. I'd rather take Mark Andrews or Trey McBride a little earlier. Maybe a guy like Dalton Kincaid or Jake Ferguson after. Just the circumstances around it. I think Kyle Pitts will improve this year, but just from a fantasy value perspective, I do not plan on picking him at his current ADP. All right, let's sit back and relax.
I get that completely. All right, Kyle Pitts. So we sat here last year, Pat, and like I said, I had to push back on all the people that were like, oh, once you're sitting there on draft day, like, you're going to fall to the temptation again. What about the upside? What about this? What about that? To which I replied and stuck to my guns and said, look, Desmond Ritter's still their fucking quarterback. Arthur Smith's still their head coach. I'm out. I'm not dealing with this with Kyle Pitts. I wasn't even really thinking about the injury portion of it, Pat. And I stayed out on Kyle Pitts. This year, none of that stuff that concerned me about Kyle Pitts that last year is a factor anymore. You've got a new quarterback, got a new coaching staff, And most importantly, Kyle Pitts is another year removed from knee surgery that was more complex than anyone let on, because the Falcons and transparency go together like oil and fucking water at this point. So Kyle Pitts did not just tear his MCL. He also had PCL surgery, which, as Jeff Mueller, a physical therapy doctor on Twitter and also fantasy football injury analyst, will tell you, is a much more complex surgery. It takes longer to recover from. He was wondering in the moment, before Pitts revealed this at the end of the year that he also got PCL surgery, he was wondering in season why Pitts was still wearing a brace after 8 months, why he was recovering so slowly, and speculated that this might have been more complicated than just an MCL tear. Turns out he was completely right. Pat, the same guy, fantasy injury analysis doctor, guy I trust very much so because he's been right on a lot of things, says he believes Kyle Pitts is going to be 100% in 2024. And this is not an injury that is going to necessarily hold him back physically. The one thing you have to worry about in these situations, Pat, and it's purely speculative, is can the player mentally get over, those limitations? Because you've heard it a million times, especially basketball players, like it takes them a while to trust their legs again, to trust their knees again. I think in a sport like football, it's a little less of a concern because you're not, jumping constantly and having to worry about it. And also it is a thing even in basketball that they get over that eventually, the potential instability of their knee that could hold them back from going completely 100%. But Pat, if we're projecting Kyle Pitts to be 100% in health again, I'm back in. And I'm not at a point where I'm not at a point where I'm targeting him in drafts, not even in the slightest. And I think you're spot on, Pat, where everybody who's ranked ahead of him, I would absolutely rather have ahead of him. And if we're looking at underdog where he's tight end 6, there are guys behind him I'd rather have, including George Kittle, Evan Engram, and Jake Ferguson. But
I didn't mention Evan Engram. Yeah, I like Evan Engram too.
That's where it stops, though. And if we get to a point in the draft where Kyle Pitts is the highest guy rated among, the rest of the guys like Brock Bowers, David Njoku, Dallas Goedert, whatever, I will draft Kyle Pitts because of that upside, because I do think there is literal top 3 potential with Kyle Pitts still. Look, am I predicting that he's going to finish that way? No, but you look at the situation he's in now, all the positive coach speak about trying to make sure they use their guys the right way, move him around the formation. If I miss out on those to me, I have Kyle Pitts as tight end 9. If he is sitting there and all of my top 8 are gone, I will draft Kyle Pitts. I will also draft another tight end later as a contingency or a hopeful lottery ticket that he works out if Kyle doesn't. But yeah, I'm not on the no Pitts diet like I was last year. So that is the breaking news from me. Because Pat,
Pitts, baby.
Who would I be if I didn't go off my own workflow and my own process of being like, yeah, everything's changed now. Like, I have to be back in. Unless I thought something was going to linger, there's no reason for me to not be back in. So back on Kyle Pitts, Pat, we can move on to the Panthers. I think we can get through the Panthers in the next 9 minutes of this show. Dave Canales, new head coach, new offensive coordinator, Brad Idzik. They signed Canales to a 6-year deal, which tells me that they think this is going to be a long process to rebuild. They are not looking for immediate results, which is, thank God, because you weren't going to get them, very obviously. Bryce Young, QB 25, 192.1 ADP on Underdog. I understand him as a deep, deep dart throw because you think he has this completely untapped potential. To me, it's a waste of a roster spot to me to throw a dart at him unless you're in a super flex league. I just think you need to see something bare minimum, even in a bad situation like last year was with the Panthers. It's really as bad as you can be set up as a quarterback. You still need to see a little more than what we saw if I'm going to believe he's ever going to become a fantasy relevant quarterback. He can become a top 15 to top 20 quarterback maybe if things break right, but there's just not enough to go off of to think, I should gamble on this guy as a fantasy quarterback. No, gamble on your Will Levises. Gamble on your, I don't know, even a Geno Smith bounce back rather than a Bryce Young, resurgence or recovery. I don't know what you want to call it.
I think that I agree with almost everything you said there. I do think Dave Canales is the guy to get Bryce Young on track because
I agree.
The thing
if anyone's going to.
The thing that was lost so much is that Frank Reich did not want Bryce Young. He wanted to take C.J. Stroud. So, he was working with a coach for the first portion of the season that did not believe he was that guy. So now, obviously, when they went and hired someone, unless they're fucking idiots, which it's the Panthers, so yes, they still are, but that they knew they were going to get someone that's saying, hey, Bryce Young is our guy. We need you to be completely on board with Bryce Young. We saw Dave Canales do it with Geno Smith. We saw him do it with Baker Mayfield. There's no reason why he can't do it with Bryce Young, but I'm with you. I don't think he's going to do it enough this year for him to be more than a bye-week, matchup-based streamer. I don't see anything beyond that. I mean, this kid was drafted number 1 overall for a reason. Hindsight's 2020 with C.J. Stroud, but I think most people at the time, I believed it at the time that Bryce Young should have been the number 1 pick.
I did as well.
And there was good reason behind that. So he can still very well be that guy. But for this year, I just don't see it. But I certainly think that we will see a better Bryce Young. Because like you said, it wasn't just like, oh, growing pains. He was awful. That team was awful last year. And of course, they didn't have the number 1 pick to go and help themselves get better. Or take Caleb Williams. But, whoops. But besides that, like, I think that we're going to see a lot of steps in the right direction here, but for him fantasy-wise, no. And I guess jumping around really quick, though, I do think, though, we saw him lean a lot on Adam Thielen last year, in terms, especially early in the year, where Adam Thielen was a lineup regular. Deontay Johnson's way fucking better than Adam Thielen. And his ADP is wide receiver 44. I love Deontay Johnson at that value because, again, you're drafting a guy who is probably not even in your flex. Like, that's probably early bench territory for the standard starting lineup.
Yep.
I think Deontay Johnson, if Adam Thielen could do it last year, if we're assuming there would be a better Bryce Young, maybe he can lock in. There's not like, there's Xavier Legette and there's your boy Jonathan Mingo, but like, if he's going to lock in with anybody, I think it's going to be Deontay Johnson. And we've seen him perform well under PPR formats before. I think wide receiver 44 is a really good value for this guy.
I would agree, and I understand the trepidation of just this offense. You know, there's a chance that it just sucks again because, again, as much as we believe in Dave Canales, Pat, like this can be a multi-year project to even get things to a remotely palatable level. But I'm with you. Deontay Johnson, there's something to be said for a guy that this is one of the guys the new regime came in and was like, we want him to kickstart this offense. And, you know, granted, that comes down to who's available, but like still, this was the guy that they handpicked and said, available. Exactly. This is the guy that they handpicked and said, we want this to be Bryce Young's number 1 receiver. We want this guy to be our X receiver. And yeah, I think at the place he's going at, it's definitely viable. I just think when you're on, ideally, you want players on good teams. You can't always have it that way. And so, you know, you look at the guys he's being drafted near, and it's guys who are on much better teams. The guys directly behind him in ADP are Christian Watson of the Packers, you know, JSN, Seahawks, Keon Coleman, Bills, Jamison Williams, Lions. But he has such a clearer and bigger role than any of those guys that I'm totally
You think he's the clear-cut number 1 guy? Obviously, there will be other guys in the mix there. They don't have a tight end. Like, I put Tommy Tremble on the list here just to put a tight end. They've got nothing at the tight end position. You're looking at Adam Thielen, who's 100 years old, and then a guy like Xavier Legette, who was an incredibly streaky kind of player, a very boom-bust kind of player.
Yeah, we don't know what he's going to
And Jonathan Mingo, who did absolutely nothing in his rookie year, despite no matter how everyone's like, oh, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Like, this is paving the way for Deontay Johnson to clearly be the number 1 guy. And granted, a team that's still not going to be very good, but it seems here that we both think this team is going to get at least somewhat better.
Marginally better, yeah. If Dave Canales can get even bare minimum out of Bryce Young, I think there's a high chance that Deontay Johnson, you're very happy that you own him on your roster. Pat, while I think Deontay Johnson's going to improve, improve on last year. I think he'll be a good add for your roster. There's another guy on this team that I think can be an outright league winner, and this is not going to be a surprise to you. It is Jonathan Brooks, the running back that they spent the, I believe, 42nd overall pick on in this past draft. 46th pick overall, I think. Same area. That is very high draft capital for a running back. You don't very often see running backs get drafted in the first round. Obviously, we saw Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs last year, but those are like
outliers.
Sort of otherworldly talent kind of guys. And quite frankly, Jonathan Brooks very well may have gone in the first round had he not suffered the injury that he did, the torn ACL. It's just a matter of time before he takes over this backfield. I don't think it's going to be right as the season kicks off. This guy is bell cow. He's going to be a monster. They're going to ease him in slowly. And because of that, I do think Chuba Hubbard, who was fairly productive last year, can be an asset for you for the first month or so of the season.
Or be 52. I think
Yeah.
that's a crazy value.
Yeah,
for
I mean,
Chuba Hubbard.
I think he's a guy who could easily perform like a top 15 back for the first month of the season, and I think you should leverage that. But I think over the course of the season, Jonathan Brooks, I mentioned it with Deontay, Pat, being handpicked by this regime. This was the player that this regime was excited to draft and excited to build their offense around. He is just a completely different tier of prospect, of player than Chuba Hubbard or Miles Sanders. And once he gets control of this backfield, it is going to be all bets are off. Like, this guy is going to be a beast. I think he'll be a weekly top 10 sort of back despite how bad this team is. And if you can get him as, what is he going at on Underdog right now? RB 22. Yeah, 86.9 overall. I will take that every single time. I plan to have a lot of Jonathan Brooks this year.
See, I don't. And not to say that I disagree with really any of your points here. It's just that I think that maybe this could be a little longer than a month or so. And it's like at RB22, that's an RB2 that you're drafting. And you kind of want him to be there more throughout the year. And I think this is a guy whose hype is only going to go up. Like, I think this is a player that guys are going to reach a lot for beyond his ADP, which is just why I don't feel like I'm going to own a lot of him. I feel like I'm going to own a good amount of Chuba Hubbard. I think Chuba Hubbard is like the 0 RB darling, because he is going to, I think, be the pretty much bona fide starter for at least, like you said, at least a month here. Do I think Jonathan Brooks wins people leagues? Absolutely. I think absolutely, but it's just like, how much throughout the year is he going to give you to warrant such a high ADP? I don't know, but again, I agree with all your points. It's just, I think that's just a little bit too rich for me, especially when I think that ADP is actually going to be higher. I feel like if you want Jonathan Brooks, you're going to need to go a little further than his ADP.
I think he'll give you a lot. And also, I should mention that that RB22 ADP, Pat, that is an Underdog specific thing.
Of course.
Fantasy Pros has him as RB34. So
Better.
if you're getting him at RB34 or even anywhere behind RB25, I think I'm definitely in. 22,
more
I'll,
in RB34
20,
for
22, I'll agree with you, is a little bit rich, but he's a guy that I'm just super excited about because it's a case
I don't
where
blame you.
I think just talent will win out, and when you can get a guy who is just clearly, to me, going to take over a backfield to himself and be able to show what he's got on a team that's trying to just find their footing and rebuild. The scoring opportunities might not be there, but he's a guy that I think they're going to be running their offense through by midseason, and I'm very excited to get him just for that purpose. So, folks, that's our time for today. That's our NFC South Fantasy Football preview. Next week, not exactly sure what we're going to do. I don't think it's time, maybe a little too early to do our pals, our favorite players for this upcoming season, but it'll continue.
We got to have our Dead Zone show soon.
Yeah, maybe we can potentially go
love
over
the
that.
RB Dead Zone?
I don't think the Dead Zone's going to change much, so we can.
That was my
potentially
favorite
go over
episode
that.
we did in the lead up last year.
That was a good one. But yes, more fantasy football coverage, folks, in the weeks to come. But for this episode, this will do it. For Pat Gustafson, I'm Brandon Carney, and we will see you guys next week.
I turned 27 on Friday, 1 year closer to death. Bye-bye.
You old bitch. All right. For anyone still watching with us in the comments, if you have any questions for us, we'll hang around and answer them for a couple of minutes. I'll give you guys some time to type those out. Hope you enjoyed our NFC South fantasy football preview. I know everybody was anxiously awaiting my thoughts
Happy
on Kyle
birthday,
Pitts.
Backyard Ballers.
The real question, do you believe in Joe Hendry? Yes, I do. That is a wrestling thing, Pat, for the uninitiated, obviously. You. Yes, Joe Hendry, future
This is
champion,
not pre-recorded.
hopefully. No.
I feel like every week we kind of get like an "Is this live?" question. Yeah, we're live.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like if you don't interact with the chat during the show, then I guess that makes sense. But yeah, no, very much not.
We got to stay locked in because I get distracted very easily, as even today. I think I did all right today, but
you did pretty good
can
today.
Get bad.
You thought it was going to be bad off the drop because you forgot a fucking word or something. But
I don't
how do
even
you
remember
feel?
what the fuck we were talking about?
How do you feel on Nick Chubb this season? Yeah, I guess we did the AFC North a few weeks ago at this point. I think Pat and I are both aligned in that we're not really interested in Nick Chubb this season, which hurts me to say, but it's a step I have to take in just. Every season's a new season, and as much as I've loved him, and I picked him with my first pick last year, and he's been rock solid for me multiple times, coming off this knee injury at the age that he's at, it just typically doesn't go well. You're likely looking at maybe some real-life production if they're lucky, maybe some goal line touches, whatever, but I just don't think you're going to be looking at consistent fantasy production, and he's just going to be, if anything, a more frustrating player to have in your lineup than anything else if you're trying to shove him in your lineup.
And I mean, Jerome Ford looked really good. Looked really good last year. He was really involved in the passing game. I expect him to be the passing game guy.
Yeah.
So I think we said he was going at like RB39. I think that's crazy value. I think it's more of like that fact that like I just really like what Jerome Ford can possibly do this year. And Chubb is just not even really somebody that's on my radar at all. Like I don't even say like, oh, I'm out on Chubb. It's just like I was never even thinking about being in on him, unfortunately. Yeah. I hope he proves this wrong. I don't think he will, but I hope he proves this wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the bull case for Nick Chubb is just that he's different. He's physically different. It's like, all these stats that we use to try to predict like Derrick Henry's fall off. It's like, yeah, he's also different than any player we've ever seen in the NFL before. So do the rules apply to him? Maybe Nick Chubb is a genetic freak. Well, we already know he is, but maybe he's a genetic freak in terms of recovery like Adrian Peterson was. Granted, Peterson was much younger when that happened to him, but it's possible. I wouldn't be completely surprised.
Adrian
I'm just not betting.
Also Adrian Peterson, though. Like we're talking all-time great.
I know, but Nick Chubb is like, I think physically not far behind him in terms of like the build. Nick Chubb has been viewed as like the best pure runner in football for the last 5 years. So, if it was going to be anybody in this era, it could be him, but it's not a gamble that I'm taking.
Yeah.
Bran, why do you hate old people? I don't hate actual old people, just in fantasy. The reason I am ageist in fantasy football is because I think it's the most unnecessary risk you can take in a game that is loaded with so many young upstart players that you can invest in instead, where it's like those guys might bust for different reasons, whether it's, their quarterback stinks or the offense just isn't scheming them up right. I will be more okay with a player on my roster busting for one of those reasons than I would be for something as easy to spot and predictable as a guy who's about to be 32 years old. Like if I draft a guy who's 32 and he falls off the age cliff when I draft him, I'm just going to be mad because I'm like, I could have fucking predicted that one. Like,
yeah,
I'm good.
I'm not nearly as ageist as Bran, but like my point to that would just be like, when it comes to that, I would rather be ahead of the curve and possibly be wrong. Like, I'd rather say, oh, this guy's old, he's washed, and him not be.
Right.
And say, oops, I was wrong, then say, nope, I'm in on this guy, and then have him burn you. I would much rather be proactive and risk being wrong than being burnt there.
Yeah, 100%. Bijan or Breece Hall? Ooh, that's tight. Bijan.
I love them both.
Yeah, I'm going Bijan, but I'd be thrilled.
I love them both very much.
Yeah, thrilled to have either one. Will Tyreek Hill be better or worse? I mean, considering he was tracking for 2,000 yards last year, I'm going to say worse just based on general regression.
Worse, but not...
But
that's a
still
very
really
relative
good.
term.
Yeah, he'll still probably be very good. He is falling into my ageism at this point. Wrongfully
is he the wide receiver 2 overall, I think? Yeah. I think he is, and I think
most
that's
platforms
fair.
Behind
I think that's a very fair place for him to be going. But I think he can't be as good, can he?
Yeah, because I hate senior citizens, I have him as wide receiver 5, but that's not because I'm projecting him to necessarily have less production than these other guys. It's just that's where I'll get over the age once I have to choose between him and AJ Brown or him and Puka Nacua, but I'm going to choose all of CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson over Tyreek Hill because they are all nasty and young. So I would just rather that combination, even though Tyreek has shown no signs of age slowing him down yet.
That would really need to be a cliff for him to fall off quickly.
Just wanting to hear what cereal the Patriots would be. I mean, we're fucking ass. So like dry Cheerios.
Fruit Loops.
I don't know.
Because I fucking hate Fruit Loops.
Frosted Flakes, because I love Frosted Flakes.
They're great.
All right, one more question here. Let's see. Who do you think is the best flex that will be available past the third? All right, I can look at the overall. I'll look at the overall Fantasy Pros rankings and knock out the top 36 players and go from there. Best, of course, Rashad White's the first skill player I see after that range. Who do I really like in this range? I'll just tell you a player I'm higher on than a lot of people, and that I actually realized this when I put together my receiver rankings today, and it's Christian Kirk. I think
Damn
Christian
it,
Kirk
you bitch, you stole my answer.
As the 57th overall player on Fantasy Pros, and what is he as the wide receiver? I think he's like, where is he? Christian Kirk is the wide receiver 29 on Fantasy Pros. I actually have him as my wide receiver 17. So that's probably where I differ greatest from general public perception. I would go with Christian Kirk because I think the Calvin Ridley being gone is a big, big boon for him.
I guess in a similar vein, obviously he's a little higher. A guy that I think might be like age cliff, he's 30, Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper's kind of similarly going in this range. He's been fantastic the last 2 years, and David Njoku really burst onto the scene there, but that was under Joe Flacco. Like, I still think Amari's the top dog in what should be a good Browns offense, unless if Groper Cleveland can, can figure it out a little bit. But yeah, I think that's solid value for him. Again, just a really reliable. Like, Amari Cooper's one of those guys where you're never excited about it, but like you're like every week you're like, yeah, Amari Cooper, like he was solid.
Yeah. That's fair. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us. We'll be here next week, 7:30 Eastern on Tuesday. But again, for Pat Gustafson, I'm Brandon Carney. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks.